If you exist in 2025, it seems sure that China is one of those places that you would be most impressed by its way of coming back in history. It used to be one of the most important places in the world. And then at some point, it fell, even though it had one of the greatest populations in the world. If you were to take one of its greatest partners in history, Egypt, you would see that even today, Egypt, which is in the top five most earning countries in Africa, still has China as its main trader. Even for a country like South Africa, which is so far the highest GDP in Africa, its biggest trade partner is China. For Nigeria, it's also China. But even though China is one of the biggest trade partners of Africa, it seems like these two places have very little interest in one another if you focus on the mainstream. The reason for this, of course, is because most people in Africa do not speak Chinese, and a lot of people in China speak English only as a second language and focus on Africa as a minority international focus. Given the fact that China is the second richest country in the world and the way it attained that monetary success and the way it went in a trajectory which some people say was unexpected, but in real life had been predicted for decades, it seems important to state how much focus the Chinese and Africans have on one another, including the entire diaspora, as countries countries in the East have been gaining more and more hold on these countries. Now, it does not need to be a very parasitical or a very, I don't know, carnivorous, predatory type of system. And the way that that will happen is by the countries understanding one another. And in order to do that, we must understand the history that lies behind these countries. As I've mentioned, the prediction of China becoming one of the wealthiest states in the world and becoming a great superpower is something that was predicted as early as the 1900s. In the 1900s, futurists sat down in several conferences, and constantly the conversation was between Japan and China and which of these two civilizations could take over. The arguments for China have always been they have a large population that's ever growing. One of the mistakes that China made was the one child policy. This mistake they made thinking in a sort of Western way of controlling populations and all of that. In real life, had they watched the futurists from the 1960s who argued that China would be one of the dominant forces because they have a large population, and that even though international trade is a very important part of a country, in real life, you still need internal markets. And these internal markets help China become one of the most formidable countries in the world. Some of the things that contribute to the GDP, perhaps the most important, are these, which are stated here: CIGXM, C representing consumption. If we read strong basis and the biggest contributor of GDP, high levels of consumer confidence, smart subsidies, fuel and electricity, and social assistance programs from the government protect consumption from external shocks and manageable inflation. This, of course, has been absolutely true for China prior to its modern world, and it was true when it finally came back to itself. When it used to be this empire of harmony, consumption was part. In fact, they invented new monetary schemes that would be used all over the world, including in parts of Africa, because, of course, it's important to talk about this from an Africa China point of view. Most of these, of course, are going to be internal. This is why, if you look at how much money China makes just internally, it's a lot. Of course, the second thing that matters is investment. So obviously, we can read here Indonesia's quarterly foreign direct investment (FDI) realization consistency posted new records in 2022. Only mild showdown in the top sources of FDI is expected in 2023. So this is Indonesia straight up. But if we talk about investment, we talk about education, which China did. We're talking about cars. We're talking about, well, traffic. We're talking about infrastructure, job creation, and it's not always money necessarily, even though investment is a mainly money thing, but also investing in things that will really not make money for a very, very long time. For example, if we relate it back to Africa, there is a large program in China to understand the languages and the internal affairs of many, many countries around the world. Because unlike last time, which that was a terrible bet, they don't put their energy on one country and assume which countries will remain stable and which countries will have a lot of money. Instead, have relations from all over the world. And those who come against it, they have no choice but to fight. And they are in the prime position to fight. As if you look at something like Africa, I think they're like 4% of their international revenue or trade revenue. And I think America was 16%, very small amount as well. Then you have East Asia for the most part being the bulk of it. Then you have the Middle East and Europe being bulked together, being the second biggest. But that changes the entire thought process of a country. Of course, the next thing is government, which is a very, very important part of it. High commodity prices, increased non tax revenue, strong revenue streams, sustained expenditure and subsidies, manageable budget deficit, all of that. So, government is a very, very important thing. And even though history has proven that not only democratic governments can create good laws, but really anybody who, if they start with a good foundation, as it is, it's mainly about platforms. If you start at a good platform, you will create a good government. And we have seen this in China, of course, because there was a point in China. Remember, Confucius was one of those who complained that most of the leaders during his day were spending all the money drinking and partying with random woman. And this led to a lull in the powers. But then Confucianism started to take off, and harmony became at the heart of the Chinese empire, and they rose again. And last but not least, trade. Of course, trade is one of the four, but there is a reason why it is only just one and not all four. Because without trade, you don't have a complete society. But if you use trade as your only thing, then by cutting you off, as it happened in some places of China, you could become crippled real quick as a society and become destroyed. I mean, remember the Mongols when they stationed themselves around the areas of trade for the Chinese where they relied on some very important food, and they basically stalled out the Chinese government, and basically the Chinese started sending some of their humans as slaves, sending some of their stuff, that the gold that the Mongols demanded, starving themselves out even more and more and more because they were not in a monetary position. And when the Mongols were ready, they struck. And they did this to many, many cities. One of them, of course, being in the Middle East, when they came after the Muslims, and they basically said, surrender now or we will stall you out and destroy you, as we have done for years and years and years. Now, in this world, the Mongols learned from the people in China and continued to do the trade thing. I mean, the Mongols at the highest level, I mean, they still controlled the society not very well because their age fell very quickly. But the one thing they relied on the most was trade. So, of course, the question will be, why does it matter what China did and how it happened? Well, it's important because, as Nelson Mandela once said when asked about whether he supports communism or capitalism, we do not care whether the cat is black or white. What we care about is whether it catches mice or not. And that is one of the things that needs to be taken very seriously about the transformation of African societies and African diaspora societies, not to get caught up in traps. Like I mentioned, China made some fatal mistakes at some point that could have crushed the societies because they were already relying on pre-established thought. So we have societies that exist now, we have rules that exist now, and we just assume that they work. I think Steve Jobs called these rules lore, Lore, meaning mythology, things that are said by people back in the day, and because they said it, it must be real. And I think it's hard to argue that Steve Jobs was not successful in all of the things that I just mentioned: investment, trade, governance or leadership, and having a good amount of consumers. In fact, you would argue if he was a president of a country or a leader of a country, I mean, what he did might have completely transformed an entire nation to become one of the strongest in the world. I mean, that's what he did to America. America is not just here. Now, I'm not putting it all at the feet of Steve Jobs. Of course, it had to do with their wide transformation. If you go and watch videos and you go and read about the history of cell phone technology and computer technology and the internet and the pre-internet era and Xerox and all those companies, the digital age, Kodak that was keeping America very rich, and many other companies at the same time, the paper companies, you will see that there was obviously a trajectory that was always going to make America become one of those countries that was dedicated and had to be that. Now, the internet is the thing that is the difference maker between most of these places. So why does population matter? Well, think about the difference between the internals of China and the internals of America. In 2021, China's GDP had 39%. 39% of it was digital or internet related stuff. Now, this is very impressive. But again, let's return to Africa. So the relations between Africa and China in general, they go back thousands of years. But the most traceable, where you can actually find items, is about 1,000 years ago. And there has been century after century transformation of this. And it shows that China at one point stood as one of the greatest partners, and Africa was one of the richest continents in the world and was a great trade partner with China. And even to this day, there are historians who go out of their way trying to trace roots to try and find why Chinese merchants would especially deliver for places as far away as Africa. Why did they care? A lot of history channels do talk about the relations between Asia and Africa, but they only talk about them in a very small way. I mean, how many people can honestly say they knew that there were artifacts that existed deep inside civilizations in Africa, and you could point exactly which civilization and what dig it was found? Which is exactly what happened with so many porcelains or so many items that were found all over Africa that had Chinese make prior and after Europeans showed up. Now, of course, it is kind of silly to compare a single country to an entire continent. So it is important to reduce it to a coast. And I reduce it to the Swahili coast. But in order to add the realities, we say China and its trade routes. Its trade routes, of course, included places like Ceylon, Indonesia, the Middle East, and India. And the reason why this is important is because we see written sources that depict for us that Chinese people ultimately knew who was on the other side of the world, and they did not accidentally trade with Africans. This was not something that they did for no reason. And they knew some of the internals of these places and how they worked. Of course, this CIGXM, which I should have explained this part in the beginning, YXM is for trade, export, and import. The word trade covers both. So I don't know why they don't put T, but that's how it's written. Now, of course, these things are taken seriously today in the 21st century, but they did not become invented in the 21st century. Of course, if we take the Swahili Coast, for example, Kilwa, we know that they had a strong group of people inside of Kilwa, the specific area in which they traded internally. If they only had external trade as one of the components, and of course I've talked about their external trade, so we don't need to talk about that. If they only had that as a reality, then their society would crumble because it would lack the other three, which are very important. So what do they trade internally? Well, so internally, if we take consumption, they had food, obviously, water, buildings, transportation, delivery systems, writing, all of these things, schools, all of these things that existed that people had to pay for to basically exist. These things are hard to think about in the 21st century because you can't picture in your head, but there are dozens of madrasas that were found in Kilwa. So they are, it's hard to think about it in that way because when you think of a civilization or whatever outside of places like Rome and stuff, people don't look into the details. Instead, they think, oh, yeah, well, civilization was pretty cool, had kings and stuff. But that's not good enough. The second one is investment. We know that Kilwa spent a lot of money inside of its entire thing, of course, because of the mosques that are there, because of the culture that was there, and because of the continual population that was there that proceeded and grew forever and ever. And then obviously institutions that grew over long periods of time. I mean, when you see the buildings in Kilwa, you may think that they were all created overnight, but some of these literally took generations to create, and then when they were created, they took generations to maintain. And that is something that is underappreciated about these civilizations, that even their monetary systems changed over the decades. I mean, some of these societies did not start with what they ended up with at the very end. One of the things that has been unknown or not recognized outside of Africa are the banking systems that existed prior to the European invasion. Because, of course, if you have money, having banks comes next. So, if we read about Kilwa, which of course has a lot of mixture since it was a Swahili region, has a lot of mixture with Arab culture, we can see that from the very beginning of its creation and then close to its invasion in the 1400s, we see a complete difference in the way that it handles money. So, for example, the Swahili Coast coinage is, with the exception of the classically inspired coinage of Aksum, the earliest coinage of sub Saharan Africa. Now, this doesn't mean the earliest money, but the earliest coins. We shall, of course, put an asterisk in front of that because of what sub Saharan Africa means and its randomness, but we'll come back. All coins bear an Arabic inscription, and it is important to stress that no coins are known that use the vernacular Kiswahili or predecessor thereof. They are known in three types of metal: silver, copper, and gold. The silver and copper coins all share common core traits. Three gold coins are known and all carry the name of Al Hussein ibn Sulmayn, who probably ruled in the 1330s. Apart from the ruler's name, they appear to carry a date which Brown has tentatively read as 72 or 73 AH and cover a range from 1320 to 1338 AD. They also name the mint as Kilwa. They weigh 3.5, 4.3, and 4.7 grams, respectively. While this weight averages precisely 4 grams, as pointed out by Horton and Middleton, it is clear that the spread is significant and no inferences about a possible desired weight for these coins can be drawn from such a small sample. They are, maybe not surprisingly, very different in appearance from both the silver and copper coins. However, their find circumstances are unclear, and the author would like to reserve judgment on these coins until further evidence emerges, as they are all of one ruler and therefore might have been only an isolated appearance, and little more is known either regarding their use, circulation, or purpose combined with their appearance towards the end of the coinage and different design from the coinage tradition in silver and copper. They are not relevant to this current discussion. The silver coins are very small, and in comparison, the copper coins are much larger. The silver coins range from 7 to 12 millimeters in size, and those are the weights in grams in weight, while the copper coins range between 19 to 25 millimeters in size and roughly zero point 0.5 to 3 grams in weight. They carry an Arabic inscription with which continues from obverse to reverse, the name of what is believed to be the ruler, his belief in Allah, and usually the rhyming of the observe and reverse inscription. In nearly all cases, the obverse was the side which carried the ruler's name, while the reverse carried the reference to Allah. All these traits remained relatively unchanged from the 9th century up until the coinage ended, probably in the late 14th century. If I remember, I will put the entire article or the entire website in the link, and it's from Open Journals. And this does describe the long history of Africa creating their own coins. Now, you're probably thinking, how does it say that it changed from the early years to the later years? Well, one of the things that changed is that even though that type of currency existed, one of the other types of currencies that existed before and during and was taken less and less seriously as time went on, especially when the Europeans arrived, was cowrie shells. These cowrie shells, of course, is one of the biggest omitted things in history. We know they've been written about. A lot of people never talk about them. Outside of Africa, they don't talk about them. And there are things in Southern Africa that I've seen where groups of women or groups of people combine and create sort of family banks where one person is tasked with gathering the money. This is a very old concept within Africa where one person is responsible for collecting the money and then divvying it back using certain internal contracts which they have used for years and years and years. Now, this article does mention these cowrie shells, But of course, the coinage and the focus on coinage as the main focus tells us that they are not looking at it from a purely African point of view. And this would be the same as going to China and asking, how many times do they have democracy in order to check if they were civilized or whatever? And if we said, okay, well, they've never really had democracy, therefore China must be a backwards state and has always been in their history, we are going to miss something. And in the same way, if we look for coinage and we obsess over coinage, then we are going to miss the local structures that existed within the African regions. If we read some of the smaller writings about the type of coins or the cowrie shells used within this region, and of course, remember, this had nothing to do with being backwards. China used cowrie systems, and some of the Southeast Asian places used cowrie systems. The Middle East, they had places that used cowrie systems. So this was a respected type of coin in the past, and there's a reason for it. So if we read this part, which is very important on cowrie systems or the cowrie system, returning to the initial question of why the Swahili Coast started to use coinage, one possible explanation is that with the rise in international trade, interactions both with foreign traders arriving on the Swahili Coast and Swahili traders traveling abroad, and the increasing size of the settlements, the use of coinage was seen as a practical step forward. More importantly, they might have been issued as a sign of authority or to establish authority, as well as providing a public proclamation of faith by the rulers, with both messages aimed at the local inhabitants and possibly the foreign, often Muslim traders who would have spent considerable time in the towns waiting for the monsoon winds to turn. That the Swahili were aware of the use of purpose of coinage in the rest of the Indian Ocean world is a given. And by issuing coins, the local rulers might have not only sought to affirm their authority in this form, but also to aid trade with Muslim trade contacts. If we look at our little chart here, we can return back to why these assumptions are made. Of course, consumption. This is why they made the coins for internal trading, investment, again, making the state seem powerful both internally and externally, of course, creating churches and all of that. Government, as you can see, when they say that the government was declaring its, well, which direction was going to go in by accepting Islam, I think to some degree, this gave it a direction, a cultural direction, because if you don't have some kind of stable culture, you're just going to move in all directions and make inappropriate moves, especially back then when there was no real true alternatives. And the other alternatives that existed were halfway across Africa on the other side, with, there were democratic systems and all of that that existed in Africa prior to the people coming in. But at that time, it was the Islamic way or the traditional African way, which it seems like they just adopted the traditional African way and threw Muslim spice all over it. Like Ibn Battuta said, when he got there, the leaders and the women and the men, they all had these cuts on their faces, showing that they had not abandoned their traditional African way, even though they had adopted a foreign religion. Now, obviously, trade, which is why one of the assumptions is trade. And I think that is a very big one, because the trade in cowrie shells, for a large part, is better for local trade than it is for international trade. And a lot of international trade for Africans was made with these precious metals, and without coining them, right? Just giving them as they are, as the raw material, or as blocks, or as these circles. What it does is it undervalues them, especially to international traders who can buy in bulk things, and it cannot be torn down to smaller monetary wealth. And of course, you need to understand the international markets. Otherwise, again, you're going to be tricked in how much something costs. I mean, we know in Kilwa, there was no silver in that region, so they had to fetch it in other parts of Africa. So the second paragraph, which we didn't read, which puts it all in context, is when looking at monetary system of the Swahili coast and the origin of this coinage, one factor has usually been omitted from the discussion, although this is beyond the scope of this paper. Other means of currency might have been in circulation at the same time as the coins. Very important that they could have been in circulation at the same time. But of course, cowrie shells are made of what? Natural stuff. And so they might have been completely abandoned, or even by the later people who didn't value them at all, just thrown out. Like, oh, there's some nonsense here. And they throw it out because they don't understand that that cowrie shell would have counted as money for the locals. And of course, it's not that they might have or might have not. We've seen it literally be written down that it counted as money in those regions, written down by the person who also wrote the report to the Kingdom of Congo, because he also wrote about other parts. And people like Offered Dapper and people like that wrote that in the Swahili coast, while there was gold, while there was all these things, cowrie shells still mattered. Now, this is how we know that it actually did exist. At Shanga, two hordes of cowrie shells were found next to each other alongside with coins as a local means of exchange. It might be considered whether the coins, which hardly left the towns in which they were minted, were a local currency as opposed to non coin money, such as beads and cowries, forming a more interregional East African currency. This is the important part as well, that the cowrie shells, though there's international use of cowrie shells, would be would matter more for the local exchange, so they trade gold and stuff like that, so that no one feels cheated in the way it is. So if someone sells something, let's say you sell gold for a gold block for 100 cowrie shells, and then you sell a t-shirt or a type of fabric for 100 cowrie shells, that when you go elsewhere in the Swahili coast, when someone sells you that t-shirt or that fabric, it will still be 100 and 100. And so it's not just a system where you buy cowrie shells for the same price as fabric, and then when you get to that other place, that fabric is useless, but the gold is like 500 cowrie shells, 2,000 cowrie shells, which would make it, dangerous. Now, I should have went and checked how much they cost, but that's for another day. Now, obviously, something that is important to think about here is that the Swahili coast as a region effectively worked as loose countries that eventually would count as one giant block. But at the same time, there were independent territories with borders, and they could and could not allow people to come through the areas, as we have seen in the time of Vasco da Gama. When he came about, he could go to one and be protected, go to the other, and they would sell him down the river to the next kingdom. And who knows how much some of those people got paid, and it was omitted from the story because, of course, Vasco da Gama is writing from his point of view, or the person who documented it, which is, I forgot it is, but it's one of the people that was in the boat with him. So we continue to read. However, the evidence in the case is even less informative than with the coinage, and cowries and beads are hardly recorded, or recorded with little detail in the archaeological record prior to Horton's excavation at Shanga. We may not be able to track the cowrie shells because, of course, they're natural, and even though they are valuable to those people, they would be considered not that valuable by others, and again tossed out by people who discovered them because they didn't see any value in them. They're like, "Where's the gold? Where's the ceramics? Where's the glass?" They took those things that they could see, the art, things that they could see value in, and everything else was basically nonsense. And of course, the cowrie shells recirculated for hundreds of years after that. And so, like money, of course, you don't just keep it in the same place. And since cowrie shells are not minted, they don't, you don't really just keep making more of them. Now, because that did not exist, in came in the Chinese. The Chinese trading things do show us class, and they show us different things that started to exist within the Swahili coast, which probably existed for, I mean, centuries. But when they finally started bringing stuff like this inside of the area, you can see that they valued it a lot and made a huge difference between the people who lived with and without these, including looking at it as a form of cleanliness and all of that. Very important thing. Now, returning to trade, which is a very, very important part of the story, the one fourth of it, the trade that came from China to Africa is one that has been transported to Asia for thousands of years. I mean, from places like Egypt, from Aksum to Yemen, at least 1000 BC, we know that this product was transported all over Asia. And even though there is a source for this inside of Asia, it seems that the African one was sought out more than the ones found in Asia. What am I talking about? Of course, I'm talking about ivory. The evidence has spoken that the African elephant, for some reason, has been traded throughout history through Europe, Asia, and even Indonesia, and the tusks are what they wanted. We find DNA evidence that ranges in date. Now, some of them have never been tested before. Of course, those in Mesopotamia, who the mainstream opinion is that a lot of that ivory came from Africa. There, again, I will mention that there are some sources that could have come from other places in Asia, but for the most part, they assume they came from Africa. Some of the ivory in the Middle East that has been found has some images of clearly Egyptian men who are shown in Egyptian themes. You can actually see the flowers from Egypt. And for some reason, they continue to depict this. This person, who is either Nubian or an Egyptian, is clearly shown here, and you can see through his face that he is from that region. Again, this might be the mark of the ivory itself, although it might just be a coincidence that it happened to be done in ivory, and they might have done it in other things as well. From the University of Cape Town, we see in the 16th century that there was a shipwreck, and when analyzed the things inside there, there was some finance from Germany, there was some materials from other countries in Europe, and then there was ivory from Africa, unsurprisingly. And where was it headed? To India. But we know India has elephants. This trade had been hijacked by the Europeans who had come in at this moment. As we read, Professor Shirikori said the shipwreck cargo contained materials from different parts of the world: Central European copper, German finance, and African ivory, all destined for India. This is an amazing snapshot of how connected the world was by the 1530s. Now, if you remember this, this might be very early African, so it might be an independent state that was trying to transport and was trading with the Europeans rather than a captured state. Professor Seeley said Chiricori approached her to discuss whether stable isotopes analysis of the nanoradioactive isotopes that occur naturally in all living organisms might help to establish the origins of the shipwreck ivory. Dr. Ashley Cattell informed Oxford, then joined UCT Stable Light Isotope Laboratory to work as a postdoctoral researcher under Seeley's guidance. Kutu's PhD researched covered isotopes in Eastern African ivory, an excellent background for this project. Through Ashley's networked contact was made with the genomics research lab in the Department of Animal Science at University of Illinois. Seeley said DNA analysis of 44 of the tusks revealed that they derived from a minimum of 17 unrelated herds of West African forest elephants with distinct family lineages. None of the tusks derived from the more widespread African savanna elephant species. Very interesting. Research indicates that only 4 of the 17 genetic lineages still exist today. Damn. A stark illustration of the loss of more than 95% of the elephants in West Africa as a result of hunting and habitat destruction. A range of habitats, stable carbon and nitrogen isotopes analysis carried out at UCT established that the elephants lived in a variety of habitats, but not in deep forests. The researchers found this surprising given that the tusks come from the forest species of the African elephant. While this species is still found outside the deep forest today, wildlife biologists thought they had taken advantage of vacant spaces opened up by the devastation decline in elephant populations in the last few centuries. The results from the shipwreck ivory demonstrate that the two species of African elephant had been sharing savanna habitats in West Africa for centuries. Now, that's very interesting because we often think about the trade of Africa between the countries outside of Africa. But as you can see here, clearly these elephants don't come from the Swahili coast, but instead come from West Africa, go into the Swahili coast, and then get traded out of the Swahili coast to India. As we can read here, an international multi institutional study initiated by the University of Cape Town involving the scientific and historical analysis of elephant tusks found in the cargo of a ship wrecked off Namibia in the 16th century revealed some remarkable findings. With the help of advanced scientific methodology, the team has been able to shed light on the origins of the more than 100 tusks recovered from the 487-year-old shipwreck, the oldest known shipwreck in southern Africa, and the largest archaeological cargo of African elephant ivory yet found. The first report on the finding was recently published in the scientific journal Current Biology. The team of researchers includes Professor Shadrach Shirikuri, the head of UCT's Archaeological Material Laboratories, and Professor Judith Seeley, the director of UCT's Stable Light Isotope Laboratory in the Department of Archaeology. Other participating institutes include University, blah, blah, blah. Fascinating finds. In 2008, diamond miners working along the coastline of Namibia discovered the remains of a Portuguese trading ship, later identified as the Bomb Jesus. The ship was part of a treasure fleet heading for India, carrying precious cargo to the trade for spices, silks, and other luxury goods. The Bomb Jesus didn't reach her destination. She was wrecked in 1533, just north of the mouth of the Orange River. Over 40 tons of valuable cargo were recovered intact from the wreck, include thousands of copper, lead, and tin ingots, as well as gold and silver coins. Well, I think that completely removes the idea that it was a internal ship. But since it was going through Namibia, clearly it was going to start from the west of Africa and travel around to the Swahili coast and then go to India since it was headed in that direction. Another interesting article is one that talks about Belgium. So, tracking the origin of worked elephant ivory of a medieval chess piece from Belgium through analysis of ancient DNA. So, as we read, the morphological identification of raw biological materials used to produce archaeological artifacts is sometimes difficult or even impossible. In recent years, newly developed biochemical techniques have allowed more reliable identification of exploited animal species, even for otherwise taxonomical undiagnostic fragments, and thus can help pinpoint the geographical origin of a raw material. However, in addition to being costly, these techniques involve destructive sampling. This explains why they are rarely applied in archaeological artifacts, especially those made of precious imported raw materials or those representing intact works of art. Here, we analyze the ancient DNA of a medieval chess piece made of ivory of unknown origin, recovered from a medieval settlement in Jambus or Namur, Belgium. This chess piece was broken during excavation. We took this unfortunate event as an opportunity to perform a DNA extraction to try to answer these questions. What proboscidean species does the ivory come from? Can we establish geographic origin of the ivory more precisely? And does doing so help our understanding of part of the trade route followed by the ivory? We sequenced two short fragments of the mitochondrial genome and compared them with publicly available DNA data. This enabled the identification of the raw materials as an African elephant, genus Lexadota, although the result cannot exclude that the ivory comes from a forest elephant. The recovered DNA sequence is currently found only among savanna elephants' DNA records. The ivory likely originates from an Eastern or South African country and was therefore probably transported along the African trade route, passing through the Swahili corridor. However, the precise itinerary followed by this ivory from the African shore of the Mediterranean Sea to Europe and then to the archaeological site from which was recovered remains unknown. Such identification contributes to documenting past trade networks and long distance exchange. While it has been long estimated that ivory that it can be found even within the Vikings has been speculated to come from Africa, this is one of the few times that we find actual evidence of it. There is something called oliphant. Oliphant is a type of ivory that was sought out by people as far away as the Vikings. And the reason they sought these out was because they were beautifully carved by people in the Mediterranean. And usually a lot of it had to do with the Arab trade. These Arab Mediterranean trade routes that ended up in the arms of the Vikings made it so that we understand that the Vikings had interest in foreign ivory. Now, why would this matter? Well, because the Vikings had a source for ivory, and most of the ivory came from walruses. These walrus tusks were used to create great things, and yes, they were used. But we know that African elephants that were traded throughout the continent, this is probably one of the things that the Swahili coast with the Kingdom of Ghana traded throughout the early period of West Africa and East Africa. And of course, some of these must have ended up in places as far away as China. This historically significant taste for ivory played a role in the history of Africa because the taste shifted from a lot of the Mediterranean to more exotic, proper African ivory. And instead of wanting raw materials, they wanted it to be carved in the styles that they preferred. And of course, when the Africans finally figured or finally used the carving inside of the taste of the Europeans, they could trade with them. But of course, the Europeans also wanted one that was typical of African culture. This one happens to be one that was built specifically for Africans, even though it shows some European design. This piece specifically shows how sophisticated the Africans were. And this one of a Portuguese troop or a Portuguese group of people showing their Christian and their dress, which is very unique to those people. The giant beard as well, the pointed noses. And it seems like they had sort of perfected this type of art by this time. This is from the 1500s. In other words, it's from the earliest days of contact between the Europeans and the people, the Edo people. I want to say that again. It's from the earliest days of contact. I remember someone said this before. You don't have to like Africa, but you're going to have to respect it for what it did in its past. And things like this made Africa fairly rich, of course, with the slave trade, gold, and other things. But artifacts like this gave it respect as a place where they could build things individually that could be sold overseas. Think about the difference between what we saw in the Chinese plate and this Portuguese depiction over here. We are not talking about some people who were taught art or people who needed to be given a new form of art. We are talking about a people who were perfectly capable of their own forms of art and had independent trade within inside their kingdoms, and they became a much bigger and much more respected area when the Europeans first came. And you can see this in the writings. The writings do not speak of the Negroes as a backwards people, but instead speak of a much higher perspective. Now, of course, this is not between European states and those. Instead, it's those in China. Now, China is one of those hard places to find African artifacts. It is difficult. Yongle is a Chinese emperor who existed in the 1400s. This emperor sent a fleet to Africa. This fleet that ended up in Africa left a lot behind that gives us evidence of this genuine trade that happened at the time. The admiral at the time who traveled to Africa brought more than just glass, more than just food, more than just stuff. And he traveled in many, many different parts of the world and ended up in Africa. One of the things that was left behind is a coin. This coin is Chinese and it was found in Kenya. This coin is specifically associated with Yongle, and it's no surprise that we do find it in this specific time because it is the proper time for the coin. And there is, of course, articles on this specific finding because inside of East Africa, we find most of the connections of China rather than finding the Chinese connections within China itself. As we can see, 6 centuries ago, Chinese explorers left this coin behind in Africa. Emperor Yongle was perhaps best known for starting the initial construction of Beijing's Forbidden City but he also sent huge fleets of ships under the command of Admiral Zheng He out across the ocean to faraway lands. The ancient Chinese coin uncovered in Kenya in John Weinstein The Field Museum, the 600-year-old coin is made of copper and silver and has a hole in the center. It's called a Yongle Tongbao and was issued by Emperor Yongle, who reigned during the Ming Dynasty between the years 1403 to 1425 AD. It was found on Manda, an island in Kenya, announced researchers from the Field Museum and the University of Illinois. And it's a tangible piece of evidence of Chinese exploration and trade in Africa years before European explorers reached this part of the world. It's easy to date the coin. Its features, the emperor's name, Yongle, was perhaps best known for starting the initial construction of Beijing's Forbidden City, but he also sent huge fleets of ships under the command of Admiral Zheng He out across the ocean to faraway lands. So we have perhaps the greatest exploration in China at one time being documented, and perhaps the greatest evidence of Chinese pre European contact with people in Kenya ever. And of course, we have other evidence from prior dates, like giraffes that were drawn, some who were bought by Arabs through the method. So they go through the Arabs and make their way all the way to China. It gets deeper than this. So I'll consider this the end of part one.